I suppose I would be willing to amend the title of this video to my favorite argument for the existence of God, because I'm not intellectually capable enough to be able to claim that this is the best or the most logically superior argument for God's existence. And it will certainly suffer from my feeble rendering of it. But of all the arguments that I've studied, I find this one to be the most persuasive and convincing because I think everybody can relate to it. It touches on every single person's experience of life, and it's also not terribly logically complicated, so I think most people can follow it. I also want to admit from the outset that there are reasonable and compelling replies to this argument, as there are to any arguments. I sometimes get the impression that for those of us that are invested in content like this, whether it's in books or whether we're watching YouTube videos, that all we need is someone who represents our particular ideological persuasion to say something in reply to someone who has said something in opposition to what it is that we believe. And that as long as someone says something in reply, then we can be consoled that we've gained the upper hand. But just because somebody speaks last doesn't mean they've actually risen to the challenge of dismantling an opposing argument. But again, I will concede that there are good and compelling and intellectually stimulating arguments against the existence of God. And if I only ever had the logic of the two positions to go on, I don't think I could ever conclusively decide that one was right and one was wrong beyond a reasonable doubt. So my hope is that a presentation like this will demonstrate to you that there are rational approaches to the existence of God and that faith can be complemented by reason, even if you've never experienced a preacher or evangelist or a faith community leader taking that approach. My hope is that you will be left with enough of a compelling impression that you'd be willing to explore this a little bit further, both intellectually and experientially. I said earlier that there are compelling atheistic arguments just as there are theistic arguments. But my experience of experimenting with and exploring the possibility of God's existence is what overwhelmingly tips the scales in that direction. Because my life has dramatically changed, and I would say improved, since I placed myself in a pattern according to Christian teaching. And by that, I don't mean that everything has gone my way since then, or that God has answered everything according to the way that I've asked for in prayer. What I do mean is that I've experienced a great deal more joy and hope and peace than I did before, and that I've endured struggles and distresses that the person I was before really would have struggled to negotiate. And I've also been freed from modes of behavior that I was really ashamed of. And at the end of the day, I've discovered a life that I've found incredibly fulfilling because of my openness to those teachings. And if you're on the other side of two compelling logical alternatives, shouldn't the one that promises a great deal of hope and even eternal life create enough incentive for you to start exploring it with more consequence than mere speculation? Because if it's a toss-up at the end of the day, then I think it makes a lot of rational sense to bet on the possibility of God's existence and to start searching for him more earnestly. Every single person that I've said that to who took me up on that challenge was not disappointed, and I don't think you will be either. I want to start out by setting the stage between two alternatives and to emphasize that you can't have it both ways, which is what too many of us try to get away with. The first option says that the physical universe, with its cosmos, planets, living things, matter, and the physical laws that govern those things, is all that there is. And so that any intellectual inquiry into truth or what is real should be limited to the scope of the physical sciences. The second option acknowledges the physical universe and everything I just described, but it broadens the scope of reality to include that which exceeds the physical universe and its fixed laws. And it recognizes that we have many experiences that indicate that there is far more than those fixed laws. So to start exploring those two options, consider the fact that every human society that we have records for, every civilization, has nurtured some sort of moral code of behavior. And in many cases, like the entire developed world of today, those societies recognize the most critical aspects of that moral code in laws that inflicted punitive measures on anyone who transgressed that moral code. And no matter how much we philosophize and speculate about the existence of a universal code of moral behavior, and try to liberate ourselves from it by claiming that there is no such thing. There's only what we happen to prefer. Everybody I know has tried to hold somebody else to some measurable standard of right and wrong. Everyone has objected when someone has wronged them, when they've cheated them or lied to them or abused them. And nobody would be satisfied with the retort, just because you don't like what somebody did to you doesn't mean it's actually wrong. That's just your preference. If good and bad is just a way of describing what you or I happen to prefer, then we would never have grounds to say that someone else should behave according to those preferences. We could never hold someone else accountable for their behavior, because in order to do so, you have to concede that there is something objective and something neutral outside and apart from our preferences that mediates between us, so that I can hold you accountable and you can hold me accountable when either of us mistreats the other. And no matter what anybody says or what philosophy you subscribe to, all of us recognize this requirement, and all of our laws are premised upon this truth. Otherwise, all you would have to judge right and wrong are preferences, and then you would have no grounds to say that someone's preferences outweigh someone else's preferences, such that your preferences to not have your things stolen or to not be abused carry no more weight than someone else's preference to steal your things or to abuse you. Unless there truly is an objective moral standard that we can appeal to judge our disputes and to hold each other accountable to. And the fact that we have laws concedes this fact that this moral standard does exist. But what are the implications of that? What are we talking about? What are we allowing when we talk about morality? Well, morality can be described as a judgment against what ought to occur and what actually occurs. For example, if somebody abuses their wife, we would be correct in saying, you ought not to have done that. We're saying that the actions and decisions that led to that abuse were the wrong ones as compared to the right ones. We're evaluating what happened, in this case the abuse, and we're comparing it to what ought to have happened, what should have happened, and saying that what actually happened should not have happened, and that the one who is guilty of committing the abuse is to some degree responsible and culpable for what happened. Now, it's important to pause and recognize that the natural sciences as a method of inquiry cannot tell us anything about what ought to happen as compared to what actually happens. The natural sciences are limited to consideration about the natural universe and are predicated on the assumption that the natural universe behaves according to fixed laws. And by fixed laws, we mean what always happens. For example, the law of gravity describes what happens when two bodies of mass come within proximity to each other. There's no option to choose something outside of the laws that we're describing. A planet can't break faith with its orbit because it wants to go somewhere else. But remember, morality tells us what should happen and not necessarily what always does happen. Whereas science only tells us what does happen. It makes observations of what happens and then it draws conclusions from those observations. But if all there is the natural universe, then there's no grounds for talking about what should happen, only what does happen. And you and I, as fixtures of that natural universe, are also inevitably bound to those same fixed laws. But with you and I, we notice that there's more going on than just fixed laws. We have an intellect and a will that governs the things that we do. We can choose between alternatives. And because of this ability, we recognize that we are responsible for the outcomes and the effects that we create through our will. We don't hold other natural elements or phenomena responsible for their actions. Like if a tsunami crashes ashore and kills hundreds of people, we don't denounce the ocean for its transgressions. We don't set up protests on shorelines and say, you need to recognize our human rights and dignity. And we certainly don't say, you shouldn't have done that. And the reason we don't do that is because we recognize that the ocean and everything that contributed to that disaster was behaving according to inevitable, deterministic, fixed laws of the natural universe. But when a person behaves in ways that we don't like, we don't say, he's just behaving according to the fixed laws of nature. No, we say he is responsible for those decisions because he is governed by more than those fixed laws. He has some agency and ability outside of those fixed laws, and that he is free from those fixed laws to some degree. But if the natural universe can only be described within that understanding of those laws and cause and effect, but we either inherit or produce a quality that breaks free from those laws and that sequence, then we have to admit that we've found something that is pervasive in the human experience and which exceeds or transcends the natural universe. In other words, there is something that is morality that is relentlessly available to our perception and to our experience that portrays something more to reality than what we can see, taste, and touch. There's something metaphysical and spiritual in our experience, and it's a big part of our experience. In other words, this something more, goodness and morality, was always characterized as a transcendental in classical thought. It transcends the natural universe. And if we're going to know or understand anything about it, we need to broaden our narrow-minded scope to admit and to explore metaphysical or spiritual reality. So now that we can understand that there is something, the moral standard or the law of right and wrong, that transcends the natural universe, what does that tell us about what lies beyond physical nature? It tells us that whatever lies beyond is intensely interested in our behavior, in right and wrong, in unselfishness and justice. And it seems to be instructing us in becoming more moral by affirming us in our good behavior and making us feel uncomfortable or ashamed about our bad behavior. The only thing we can compare it to is a mind with will and purpose and intention. We can't talk about matter as if it's guiding or instructing us, and we certainly can't talk about it like a natural law, because as we've already seen, natural laws don't give allowances for us to disobey. And the fact that we can disobey and aren't forced to conform ourselves to these moral instructions, that tells us a little bit more, I believe. It makes love, or the free gift of self, possible. Like, what good are marriage vows if the one reciting them is forced to do so? And what good is a promise if it can't be broken? Love acquires its significance because it doesn't have to be given. That's what makes it so amazing when someone chooses to love us. So this power behind the moral law, it doesn't impose, it doesn't force the moral law on us, and it makes love possible, which leads us to a very personal perception of whatever it is that lies beyond the natural universe. Now, a quick house cleaning item before we wrap up. This narrative and argument isn't designed to consider or assert anything specific about God. It's not meant to propose Christianity or any other theological framework. It's only designed to assert the existence of God and nothing else. Anything else you'd want to say about God would have to be considered in another set of arguments. So all I've done here is followed a logical sequence of premises which draw the conclusion that there is something that exceeds or is outside the natural universe, which is deeply concerned with our moral behavior, and with all of those variables combined is best described or is most reminiscent of a mind. Thank you so much for watching that. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you got something out of it. And if you did, and you want to consume more content like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel. Or if you saw this on Facebook, then like my page and follow along. If you're on YouTube, it's not enough anymore to subscribe because YouTube wants to think that it can tell you what you should watch instead of what you actually want to watch. So in this case, you actually have to hit that little bell to be notified as to whether or not I've uploaded something more recently. So please subscribe and hit the bell at the same time. That really helps me out a lot. And if you could consider sharing this among your social network, that helps me a lot too. And if you want to support the making of these videos, please consider supporting my business, which is a communications and strategic marketing company who specializes especially in branding and web design. And this is especially catered towards ministries and apostolates and parishes. We have a parish web design system that we've built specifically for parishes and churches that is affordable, but also beautifully packaged and easy to use. So if you're interested in that, check out my business, which is holdsworthdesign.com, and hit the contact button in the navigation and get in touch, and we can figure out if there's a good fit for you there.